Is that all right? Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for what I know will be a really inspiring and intellectually enriching conversation. It gives me enormous pleasure also to be able to serve as, a moderator for an event that is being co-sponsored by the History Department of the University of Pennsylvania and the Mesa Global Academy. And through this partnership, we are now able to put together this panel conversation on transnational Persian history and literature. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our colleagues who are experts in this field, Dr. Nasr Ahmad Arian, who's the title of his talk is A Discourse and Narratological Typology of Persian Prose Fiction in Afghanistan, and Dr. Khalilullah Afzali, Unseen Sources, the New Historical Narrative of Northwest Afghanistan in the 19th Century. Before we begin, I also want to take a moment to very briefly, read the bios of our scholars. By the way, can you all hear me okay? Am I audible to you? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'll begin with Professor Arian, who is currently at Penn State University in the history department. And he has been teaching undergraduate level courses, including on Iran's modern history from the Qajar to the present, Afghanistan's modern history, in a course titled The Cultural and Political History of Afghanistan from the Timurid period to the present, Persianate World and Cultural Studies, as well as Introductory, Intermediate, and Advanced Persian Language. I have to say, I think Penn State is so lucky to have such a sort of your diverse skill sets and your ability to be able to, cross these boundaries through the wonderful offerings that you do provide. And so thank you so much. And prior to that, Professor Arian also was at the Allame Tabatabai University in Iran in the Persian Language and Foreign Languages Department, where he taught graduate and undergraduate level courses of Persian language for non-Persian speakers. And these were courses designed for foreign students who were studying in Iran. And prior to that, he was also a lecturer at Al-Biruni University in Afghanistan in the Department of Persian Language and Literature. And now I'm going to turn to Professor Khalilullah Afzali, who is a specialist of Persian literature and manuscript culture. Currently, he is a visiting professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, where he teaches graduate seminars and conducts research. He's the founder of the Baisungur, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Historical Heritage of Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Baisungur, a research institute in Afghanistan, which focuses on the study and preservation of the literary, cultural, and historical heritage of Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Iran. In his research and teaching, Afzali focuses on codicology, Sufism, literary history, and the deal studies. He has published 2 books and more than 30 papers in Persian, both in Iran and Afghanistan. He's also the chief editor of Name Baisungur annual journal, which features work on Persian literature, art, and history. Thank you so much for appearing here today. And without further ado, then I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Arian so that he can begin his talk. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy being here and speaking about the course of prose fiction in Afghanistan. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Firoozeh at University of Pennsylvania, who managed this talking series, and Mesa Global Academy introducing me and some of my other friends to Dr. Firoozeh. I'm Nasr Arian, previous Associate Professor of Persian Language and Literature at Al-Biruni University in Afghanistan, and currently I'm teaching Persian language and cultural and political history of Afghanistan. First of all, as you see the title of my talking, a discursive and narratological typology of the prose fiction in Afghanistan. Let me give you a general information on storytelling in Afghanistan. I critically read Persian novels in Afghanistan from 1919 to 2020. And after that, I classified these 100 years of novels in Afghanistan based on narrative and discourse, highlighting the modernity, postmodernity, and classic aspects of these novels. And also, I saw which type of discourse the different generations of narrative created in these 100 years of novels in Afghanistan. So what I am to articulate here is not a comprehensive reading of the article with all its details, as time does not permit. Rather, I intend to provide a short overview and highlight the most crucial points and findings of my article. The historical background of modern Afghan fiction dates back approximately 100 years. Some consider the emergence of modern fiction to be concurrent with stories written by Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani or Sayyid Jamaluddin Asadabadi. I believe you have heard the name of Sayyid Jamaluddin, one of the predominant figures, not only in Iran and Afghanistan, but in most of the Islamic countries. On the other hand, most Afghan writers, however, attribute the title of the first modern novel to the Great Jihad or Jihad-i-Akbar, written by Muhammad Hussain Punjabi in 1919. Muhammad Hussain Punjabi was also a professor or teacher in Habibia College or high school at the beginning of the 20th century. Others argue that the translations of works by Mahmoud Tarzi in the early 20th century were the initiator of the move towards Western and modern fiction styles. Mahmoud Tarzi was also one of the important figures of intellectualism at the beginning of the 20th century in Afghanistan. So nonetheless, I will focus on an objective and scholarly classification of the history of Afghan fiction based on inherent narrative characteristics, irrespective of historical and political events, or number of works, or specific periods. The majority of novels written in Afghanistan before 2000 adhere to a performative discourse system and the first generation of narrative, which focus on the creation of meaning through binary oppositions or subject-object interactions. In this discourse system, the object holds intrinsic importance and all actions are aimed at gaining possession of that object. The different narrative styles distinguish the last 2 decades of the 21st century from earlier periods of storytelling in Afghanistan. These distinguishing styles include temporal plays, authors' familiarity with modern storytelling techniques, the shift from heroism to character development, the transformation of classical narrative generations into modern narratives, and finally, the changes in value and discourse system. So before this classification, there are some classifications that they have done from the history of prose fiction in Afghanistan. So Let me have a review of that literature. Previous classifications of Persian fiction in Afghanistan have mostly been based on historical and political events, and the number and diversity of works without considering their qualitative aspects. Sometimes these classifications have been carried out based on literary forms or genres of storytelling. For example, Nasr in his book, The Dawn of Dairy Fiction, or in Persian, Sapi Dami Dostan Nevisi Dari, which is written in 2005, divides the Persian fiction in Afghanistan into 4 stages based on decades: first decades, second decades, and third decades. And similarly, in Muhammad Hussein Muhammadi's book, The Analytical Literary History of Afghanistan's Fiction, that in Persian it was Tarikh Tahlili Dostan Nevisi Afghanistan, which is written in 2009. The literary history of Afghanistan is divided again into 4 periods. This classification is also temporal. Furthermore, Latifi Nazimi, in his article, A Glance to the Contemporary Literature of Afghanistan, نگرشی بر ادبیات معاصر Afghanistan in Persian, which is written in 2005, discuss contemporary Afghan poetry as well as the status of narrative literature. So he has divided and classified the prose fiction in Afghanistan based on political events. In addition, Humayra Qadiri, in her book, The War in Exile in Afghanistan Fiction, that in Persian it was Jang و غربت در ادبیات داستانی Afghanistan, which published in 2015, devotes the second chapter of that book to the history of storytelling in Afghanistan. In this brief section of the book, more emphasis is given to the political historical events rather than the literary aspects of storytelling, and all claims are undocumented and unattributed. So the method employed in this research is entirely different from the methods mentioned in the review of the literature. After reading the most important novels of the last 100 years, without considering historical or political events, and without categorizing literature from the perspective of form or genre, I create a new classification of Afghan literature by analyzing 2 essential characteristics. First, discourse, and second, narrative. Then I shed light on this new classification by analyzing the qualitative aspects of Afghan storytelling. So here I will present my classification based on these 2 terms, discourse and narrative. So what I have done here, these 2 terms are sometimes classic and sometimes modern. So the first classification that I have done from the history of prose fiction in Afghanistan is classic discourse and classic narrative. It means that both of these 2 terms are classic, or they are analog. So in this category, both the meaning is produced based on pre-existing assumptions, and the narrative is past-centered and classical, respectively, heroization, binary oppositions, actions, and the acquisition of valuable objects are all based on a predetermined program and past-oriented perspective. The discourse as the source of meaning production is also analogous, and these novels are completely past-oriented or past-centered. It means that the discourse is actantial and shapes the programmatic semantic system. The meaning derived from such a discourse is shaped by conventional intellectual traditions and prevalent assumptions. And to produce this meaning, the discourse does not create any barriers along the narrative path. Time linearly narrates events without any significant deviation from the fabula. Analog narrative or classic narrative means that time progresses naturally without any obstacles or analysis, leading to the formation of a linear system. When discourse is analog or classic, it means that it produces superficial meaning. Classic discourse carries explicit and fixed meanings because it is based on presuppositions that everyone agrees with. What this discourse produces is a meaning and not signification. And you know that there is a complete difference between meaning and signification. So the classic discourse produce meaning, not signification. In such a system, connotation, which is the basis of the literary text's value, does not form. Everything from meaning to narrative is clear, unambiguous, and non-connotative. In other words, classic discourse means that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is concrete and logical. Each signifier refers to a predetermined signified outside the text. The meaning is the result of this correspondence. The narrative in this type of fiction also follows a linear, action-based, normative, and prescriptive system. There's an external value beyond the subject, and the heroes fight with each other to obtain this value. A careful examination of each of the novels and stories before 2000 leads to this conclusion. Works such as Jihad-i-Akbar or The Great Jihad, which published in 1919 and also was known as the first contemporary Persian novel in Afghanistan. Its content revolves around jihad and the British invasion, as well as the heroics of Muhammad Akbar Khan, who was the main character of this novel. In this novel, the established meanings based on absolute ideological presuppositions are not challenged, and there is no sign of softening or breaking the dominant ideological roles. All actions in this novel are performed to obtain an external value and produce a predefined meaning. This indicates classic meaning. The narrative in this work is also adheres to a linear system, and time in this story and in this kind of discourses runs parallel and synchronously. Similarly, the narrative of this story, the image of byword or taswir-e-ibrat, which was published in 1921, follows the same pattern. In this story, the word of the subject and the word of the signifier or the word of the object is completely separated and disjointed. All actions of Bibi Khorijan, who was the main character of this novel, are done to obtain a signifier that exists outside of her world. The events are planned in a way that serves as an organizing effort to attract the attention of Bibi Khorijan's husband. In such a narrative, where the issues of acquiring an external signifier value is prevalent, the discourse is classical, action-oriented, and analog. The relationship between linguistic levels in these novels is also concrete and logical, because each signifier refers to a specific signified outside. And there is no floating signifier observed in these novels. This situation is observable in most of the novels and stories before 2000 in Afghanistan. The second category of this classification is classic discourse and modern narrative. So here we can see that from these two terms, discourse and narrative, one of them is modern and another one is classic. So for the first time in the year 2000, the process of fiction production in Afghanistan faced a paradigm shift, transformation, and change in discourse and narrative. During this time, there were instances where discourse moved from the axis of analog or classic to the digital or modern. And sometimes the narrative, or both narrative and discourse, underwent such transitions. Examples of these distinctive narratives are found in the works of Muhammad Hussein Muhammadi, especially the novel Unhappy or Nashad, Azizullah Nehoftas novels, and Taqi Wahidi's books, and also Qawi Jobran and Humayra Qadiri's works, Siamak Herawi's novels can be categorized under this stage. In these novels, there is no profound change in the discourse and meaning production level, but the type of narrative undergoes a transition, presenting the shift from classical narrative to modern narrative. Time fragmentation, non-linearity, the alteration of the subject-object relationship, and non-programmaticity are among the most important narrative features that were not prominent in our storytelling before. Works with such characteristics are classified as the second type in our fourfold classification. The second category of this classification, the third category of this classification is modern discourse and classic narrative. So here we see that discourse is modern and narrative is classic. This category indicates a situation where meaning has transformed. Discourse has moved away from the classical system. Meaning has broken the veil of habit and has been propelled from the past to the present. In this stage, meaning is not a product of predetermined confrontation, intentionality, or program. The dust of habits in the bygone era have not settled on the meaning. Rather, meaning exists in the present moment and arises from the current situation. However, the narrative and the way this meaning is reflected remain linear and classical and action-oriented. This meaning is only modern in terms of time or history. It pertains only to the discursive realm of the present and does not reference the past. The most distinctive example of this situation is the novel Invalidated Gods or Khodayan Mansukh by Siamak Herawi, Alives or Zindegan by Mujib Mehrdad, and the novels of Asif Sultanzadeh and some of the other novels in Afghanistan. The fourth category of my classification is modern discourse and modern narrative, where we can see that both of these terms and both of these acts are modern. This category represents a form that is characterized by an organic and referential structure. In the second and third stage, we moved from either discourse or narrative to the realm of pure meaning or modernity. But in the fourth group, we connect both the meaning and the way it is reflected to the referential and the signifying. So in this category, there is harmony between the tool and the objects. The meaning of the present is reflected in the manner of the present. Digital discourse or modern discourse and modern narrative represents a situation where both the systems of meaning and the discourse and the systems of narrative have undergone a profound transformation. Meaning is neither a result of the confrontation and relationship between concrete signifiers, nor is the narrative action-oriented and prescriptive. Modern discourse creates a modern narrative, and modern narrative reflects the modern meaning. There are numerous examples of this situation in the novels from 2000 to 2020. And Rahnavard Zaryab is the representative of this category. His works such as The Coin Solomon Found or Gulnar and the Mirror, the Fifth Darwish or Darwishi Panjum, the introgen that creatures and the animals set up, and most of other novels written by Rahnavard Zaryab can be categorized under this stage. And also all of the novels by Khosrawi Moni, Azizullah Nehofte, Kawi Jobran, Nahid Mehgan come under this category. So I think I had only 20 minutes, so I want to shorten it. In this short study, we addressed two questions that were raised for this research. First, the question of how can Afghan storytelling literature be scientifically categorized? So we answered that unlike previous classifications, which were mostly based on history, political events, the number and diversity of works, and chronological periods, in this study, with reference to the terms discourse and narrative, based on the intrinsic characteristics of narrative texts, our storytelling literature was divided into four categories that was explained before. The characteristics of each category were analyzed and evaluated in a documentary and analytical manner. Furthermore, the second question that we had in this research, can we adopt another approach based on its intrinsic characteristics for the classification of Afghan storytelling literature, in addition to historical, political, and chronological factors? Yes, we can present classification of Afghan storytelling literature in a scientific and analytical ways, considering the structural, narrative, and semantic characteristics of the works. Moreover, it was observed that in this study, by identifying four relationships between discourse and narrative, the 100-year story of Afghan storytelling literature was divided into four groups, and examples of each group were provided. It was demonstrated that Afghan storytelling literature can be categorized into these four distinct groups, and this classification not only facilitates the understanding of our storytelling literature, but also directs our perspective on narrative works. thank you so much for. So if I'm going to stop here, if there is any question, comment.
Thank you very much for that really insightful and very complex and detailed explanation of sort of the development and the positioning of modern Afghan literature in this time period. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions actually from the audience. If you both agree, though, we'll take the questions at the end, if that's okay. And so at this time, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Afzali, so he can. So we now sort of shift. Are we shifting into the Timurid period? Is that what's happening?
No,
Or are you bringing
it's
the modern period? I'm
yeah,
not.
modern period.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen at first. Oh, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the prestigious institutions of Pennsylvania University and Mesa Global Academy, especially Dr. Firoozeh, Kashani-Sabet, and Mimi Kirk for organizing this meeting for the discussion of Afghanistan historical scholarship. It's truly an honor for me to be invited here today to share my research with such a distinguished audience. My talk today has two main parts. First, I would like to introduce briefly some features of historical situation of Afghanistan. And in the second part, I will share some historical and literary characteristics of two previously unseen resources that I'm currently working with. The 19th century was a turbulent period for Afghanistan. During this time, the country was involved in conflicts with the global and regional powers of the time, as well as internal wars and ethnic and religious suppression. In this century, Afghanistan fought two times against Great Britain, once with the Tsars of Russia and several times with the Iranian Qajars. Among the internal wars were the battles of the rulers of Herat, Kabul, Kandahar, and Balkh with each other in different periods, from the beginning to the end of the century. In this period, a trend of official historical narrative was recognized in Afghanistan, the historical writings affiliated with the Kabul court. This trend, which was written either by the court secretaries or sometimes by the kings themselves, privileged events based on the preferences and interests of the court. These historians, in line with the king's interests, gave a lot of explanations of certain events that were appealing to the court and, of course, not entirely in accordance with reality. For a number of events that were accompanied by defeat and were not pleasant, they either did not mention them or glossed over them. Sometimes even disclosing negative aspects of tribal governance in Afghanistan, such as discrimination or oppression, were not mentioned. Poverty, contagious diseases, lack of infrastructure, scientific stagnation, superstition, and illiteracy were among the most important characteristics of Afghanistan in this century. The king were the main cause of the situation. A reader looking through all Kabul court historical sources won't find a single sentence on these issues. These sources try to show the governance of each ruler as good and ideal. Considering the rulers of Kabul in this period and the historical sources written in their courts, we find that in total 9 rulers ruled in Kabul, 4 of whom came to power twice. The court-affiliated historical sources in this period include 8 works. In terms of the selective treatment of history in the court historical writings of Afghanistan, I would offer the following examples. While sources available in Afghanistan about the Anglo-Afghan wars are widely known, most of these resources do not tell the complete truth of the story. For example, most sources mention the Second Anglo-Afghan War in Maiwand, which led to the victory of the Afghan army, but they remain silent about the battle of the happened right after this incident in Kandahar, which led to the defeat of the Afghan army. Or as another example, the historical sources of Afghanistan do not tell of the military march of Rahim Gholi Khan, the Amir of Khiva, toward the vicinity of Herat in 1842. The Amir of Khiva had marched to the Herat at the request of the Jamshidi tribe of Herat and Badghis provinces to save them from the oppression of Wazir Muhammad Khan, ruler of Herat. The Amir finally decided not to fight and just transferred 12,000 of the Jamshidi families to Khiva. A final example would be the war between the Iranian Qajars and the army of Haji Firoozeh in 1807. This battle, which occurred on the Shakiban plain of Herat, led to the defeat of the army of Herat and the payment of tribute by Firoozeh. The historical sources of Afghanistan have passed very quickly by it. In the same way, the social and cultural condition of Badakhshan, Balkh, Meymaneh, Herat, and Kandahar are not available from the court historical sources of our history. Although not much information can be obtained from the internal and governmental sources to cover these events, foreign sources, including Afghanistan neighbors and global powers, have not remained silent on these issues and have presented their own accounts of the events. For example, in the case of the Khiva Amir's campaign to near Herat, one of his secretaries wrote all the details and events of the campaign in a book titled The Conquest of the Jamshidi Tribes, which in Turki Jolatai is Fath Tawaif Jamshidi. He even included correspondence between the Khiva Amir and the rulers of Herat, Meymaneh, Saripol, Shawargan, and other northern provinces of Afghanistan. These letters are essential for studying the developments of Afghan history and identifying the rulers of the country in this century. Another example would be that one of the secretaries of Prince Muhammad Wali Mirza, the governor of Mashhad, who was present in the Battle of Shakiban, discussed this event in detail. I will refrain now from mentioning the many sources that the Russians and British wrote in this period through their envoys. There are also sources that were written in Afghanistan in the remote villages of Herat and Faryab, independent of the politics of Kabul. This is the book of Fateh Tawaif Jamshidi that the first one has published in Vienna, and we have translated this book by one of my friend Ahmad Hosseini Marwi in 2021 in Herat. This is the village of Barnabad, east of Herat. There are also, these sources recorded their own accounts of the events of the 19th century. Many of these sources have remained unknown for a number of reasons. I have access to some of these sources, which sometimes offer a new narrative of historical development in this period. I would like to introduce them briefly. In 1807, Muhammad Reza Barnabadi, who was from Barnabad, this village, who was from Barnabad, uh, a village 40 miles west of the city of Herat and belonging to Mirzayan Barnabad, a political and cultural family, began writing a family anthology. Muhammad Reza, in addition to being a poet and writer, held positions such as the representative of the Arian province and the minister of the estate lands of Herat for many years. He lived in Herat with honor until the death of Timur Shah in 1793. With the coming to power of Shah Mahmud and Firouzeh, who were Sunni Shia, Muhammad Reza and his family were persecuted for their previous ties to the Safavid and Qajar rulers. The family anthology that Muhammad Reza left behind is one of the most valuable sources for understanding the social and cultural history of Herat. Since Barnabadi had access to many documents and books in the houses of his ancestors, he was able to record letters, genealogies, decrees, and other important documents related to his family, the Safavid and Durrani kings, and the Saduzai rulers of Herat. Barnabadi's documents are vital to study the social and cultural situation of Khorasan, including Herat, Marv, Jam, Qa'in, and Mashhad from 16th to 19th centuries. In this anthology, the author has documented scholars, poets, and politicians of the period and samples of their previous unknown literary works. The anthology include invaluable information about the literary, artistic, and political activities of a family prominent in the culture and politics of Herat. Barnabadi wrote the book in two major sections. First, the biographies of the family's celebrities. Second, social and cultural developments in the region, with a detailed description of the oppression and injustice in the region perpetrated by the Saduzais rulers of Herat, focusing on the oppression that he personally received from the Shah Mahmud, Firouzeh, and other leading officials. Barnabadi has candidly depicted the chaotic state of the era, including bullying, extortion, plunder, imprisonment, and murder, and offers sharp criticism of the era. The author notes in one place that this situation was not only his, but that every day nearly 100 people like him suffered from these problems and fell into the hands of ignorant and cruel people. He calls that era the famine of humanity and the slack market of morality, which did not have peace from the rulers even for a day. In this book, notations of the price and value of animals, objects, goods, land, agricultural tools are very informative to gain an understanding of economic situation of the era in which the author lived. The description of occupations, customs, and the daily life of people is important from an anthropological perspective and vital for today's reader. For example, he has revealed how his cash, houses, gardens, property, and household belonging, library, horses, and other valuable possessions were taken by force with the names of individuals and exact details of rate, time, and place. He even mentions the name of the books that were stolen. In his work, Barnabadi calls the prevention of destruction of the remaining works, the awareness of future generation of the condition of their artist ancestor, and the taking lessons from the injustices that the rulers of that time inflicted on them, the main motivation for writing this anthology. Barnabadi was very concerned about the loss of his work by his opponents due to the revealing content of the work, and therefore decided to rewrite it personally several times. He distributed these copies to his relatives and sons so that if any copies were lost, at least one copy would reach future generations, which would make them aware of the oppression that had been inflicted upon him and his family. I have identified 3 handwritten copies of Barnabadi's work so far. One copy is kept in the library of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. Another copy is kept in the library of the Academy of Sciences of Afghanistan in Kabul, and the third copy belongs to a private collection in Herat. From right is the copy that is now keeping in the private collection in Herat, and the middle one is the copy now in the Academy of Sciences of Afghanistan in Kabul, and the left one is the manuscript in Moscow. Another copy, yes. The Herat copy is a more detailed copy and seemed to have been written after the other 2 copies. In Afghanistan and Kabul, although this copy was available to researchers, it was ignored by court and governmental historians because it presented a horrific picture of discrimination and oppression in Herat during the reign of Saduzais. Even some historians, including Azizuddin Wakili Popalzai in his book titled Timur Shah Durrani, considered Barnabadi to be someone who deserved extortion and without providing evidence accused him of financial corruption during his previous career in the Herat court. Government historians in Kabul in the 20th century tried to portray the Saduzai government of Herat in the 19th century as a popular government with religious freedom, public welfare, and thriving literary and cultural market. However, the information that Muhammad Reza provided in his anthology shows a different picture. Some researchers in Kabul used this work, but they did not even once address the author's pitiful situation and his complaints. Afghan scholar Reza Mayel wrote a book about this family entitled Mirzayan Barnabad, but not once in the whole book mentioned the challenges and problems of the era, nor the atmosphere of oppression and chaos that prevailed in it. If he had mentioned these things, his book would not have been published. The copy of this book in Moscow was of interest to Russian researchers because it reflected the social development of the region, and in 1983, Natalia Tomanovich published it as a facsimile print with a Russian introduction. This book, due to the lack of the necessary indexes as well as the text being captured only in photographs, was not very well received in Afghanistan and Iran. This is the book that Natalia Tomanovich has published in Moscow. I have begun to edit this work based on photographed copies of the 3 manuscript copies that I have had in my possession for about 3 years. This edition will be published with a detailed introduction and the necessary indexes comparing the 3 manuscripts with each other. In my critical edition, the basic copy is the Herat copy, which includes more information than other copies. Another example of previously unseen sources that can shed some lights on some of the historical events are Maqamat writings, a kind of Sufi works in northwest Afghanistan. Let me explain how I was introduced to these sources. The political upheaval in Afghanistan in 2021 and the conquest deterioration of its economic situation led to a transformation in the field of librarianship there. People were forced to sell often at a very low price, manuscripts and rare books inherited from ancestors, sometimes centuries before. Unfortunately, this situation led to many good copies leaving the country. However, in Herat during this time, I was offered a manuscript for sale, which later became the subject of my extensive research on the history and literature of northwestern Afghanistan in the 18th and 19th centuries. This manuscript was one of several Magamat books about Sufi Islam, a Sunni Naqshbandi saint who was a renowned hero of Herat in the 19th century. It was probably written in the 1860s by Ibrahim Shakibani, one of his Khalifas or representatives and disciples. The author of the book was originally an Uzbek grandson of one of the prominent Khalifas and disciples of Sufi Islam. In this book, Shakibani wrote about the life and miracles of Sufi Islam, as well as those of 138 Khalifas up to his time. The book is a mixture of poetry and prose. In this book, which deals with the life and works of the Sufi saints of the northwestern regions of Afghanistan, and anecdotes and events mentioned in the text reveal various literary and historical developments of the region in the 19th century. Writing maqamat for Sufis is a long-standing tradition in Persian literature that continued from the 12th to 20th centuries in Herat, west of the Afghanistan. There were many maqamat written in the 14th to 16th centuries. At that time, Sohrawardiya, Zainiya, Naqshbandiya, Sufi orders were prevalent in Herat. However, over the following 2 centuries, Sufi writings were unknown in this region. After this gap, writing arose again in the second half of the 18th century, beginning with maqamat for Mullah Gandum Ali, a Sufi saint who had political interest in Ahmad Shah Abdali. In the 19th century, at least 7 maqamats were produced for Sufi Islam, and in 20th century, more appeared for other Sufi saints. Sufi Islam and Uzbek by tribe was a Khivan ancestry. He was born near Maymana in 1725. He spent his early life in Bukhara and other cities of Transaxiana. Finally, he came to Herat and settled in Karokh, a dependency of Herat, where he established a convent or khanqah there. A great number of disciples assembled around him and bestowed a great authority upon him. He assembled many disciples from Jam, Bakharz, and Bukhara to Badakhshan and Kandahar. For almost 60 years, he became a leading preacher and guide for his disciples. After his death, his family carried on his legacy in 2 centers, Karokh in Herat and Khaja Kenti in Faryab. His descendants are well known in the region by the name of Sheikh al-Islami and Hazratis. Zikr Arra was the main innovation of Sufi Islam in the Naqshbandiya order. The first maqamat of Sufi Islam was written in Fargana by his son Junaidullah Haziq. Later, it became one of the sources for other maqamat writers focused on this same. After this work, at least 5 other works were written in poetry and prose about Sufi Islam. On average, every 3 or 4 decades, this maqamat has been rewritten based on the evolving understanding and reception of readers and audiences. Even now in Herat, some people are collecting and eradicating the previous versions of the maqamats and trying to rewrite new versions of them. Since this order is more popular among the villagers, the historical events in the villages and surrounding area are also discussed more in the maqamats. Various clans and tribes of Hazara, Jamshidi, Firuzbuhi, Temuri, Zuri, and Afghan have been mentioned many times in these works. Apart from this, perhaps this is the only source that has mentioned the rulers, jurists, and elders of these regions, such as Karimdad Khan Hazare, Yelantush Khan Jamshidi, Chin Khalid Khan Temuri, and some other people. Before these works, there was no information about the conditions of ordinary people and remote areas. In the absence of culture supporting courts, this Sufi order was the center of literary activities in the region in the 19th and 20th centuries. Valuable information and example of a number of poets and their works are recorded in Maqamat, which cannot be found anywhere else. In this period, poets were composing sonnets and masnavis, and writers were interested in commentate of Sufi works. Many scribes were copying the Sufi works in Sufi Islam's Khalifa's circles. Among the favorite works of the Sufis of this period were the Masnavi, its various interpretations, the works of Ibn Arabi and Amir Hosseini Sadat Ghuri. These maqamats offered their own version of events, such as the confrontation between Haji Firouzeh Saduzai and the Qajar army, as I mentioned before. During this battle, which took place at the plain of Shakiban, west of Herat, on June 29, 1807, Sufi Islam and a large number of his disciples and adherents were killed. These events had previously been documented only by Iranian, British, Russian, and Transaxiana sources. Among these documents are memories of Simonich, Russian ambassador in Tehran, the Afghan connection by George Pottinger, and the hero of Herat by Maud Diver from the British perspective. Ashraf al-Tawarikh by Muhammad Taqi Nouri, Zulqarnain by Fazlullah Shirazi in the 1830s, Nasikh al-Tawarikh by Lisan al-Mulk in the 1850s, all Iranian. The Afghan perspective was undocumented until the Maqamat covering the Shakiban battle and other events in the 19th century. In these books, the authors state the reasons for the Herat army's defeat and the betrayal of a few Afghan army commanders. They also mention the long list of Afghan martyrs. For example, Maqamat state that the governor of Herat invited Sufi Islam to combat the Ghazalbash army and persuaded him to join the battle. Iranian sources, on the other hand, identify Sufi Islam as the instigator of Firouzeh military actions. According to these Maqamats, the Herat court tried to characterize the battle as a religious war between Sunnis and Shias in order to receive the support of the largest Sufi order in the Herat region. Haji Firouzeh succeeded by combining Sufi Islam troops with the Herat army. Mir Izzatullah states in his travelogues that Firouzeh also sent a delegation to Bukhara to raise the religious issues and request logistical and military support. Later, with the defeat of the Herat army, this religious conflict increased. Many Sufi Khalifas wrote books on decline of the Shia by the name of Radd Rawafiz. The alliance of Sufis and the Herat court led to Sufis consistently standing with the government's actions. This reached the point that a forced migration of 12,000 Jamshidis families from Herat to Khiva in 1846 by the Herat king Wazir Yar Muhammad Khan was called by the Sufis a punishment for this people and a miracle by one of their saints. The date of transferring of 12,000 Jamshidi families was 1838. In Qamari calendar, it was 1258. Cultural and social situation. Rumi's Masnavi had a very high position in Sufi circles in Herat during the 19th century. In their assemblies, the Masnavi was continuously read and interpreted after morning prayers. Sufi Islam was interpreting the Masnavi at his assemblies. Some of his Khalifas wrote commentaries on the Masnavi. Concurrently, in other parts of the country, including Kabul, Kandahar, and Badakhshan, the Sufis of the Qadiriya order preferred to focus on Bidil and other Indian-style poets. From this point of view, the taste and interest of the Naqshbandiya Sufis in the west of the country towards Rumi and Hafiz contrasted markedly with the Qadiriya Sufis of other parts of Afghanistan. Literary prose in Herat during this period shows a serious decline in comparison with the past and its golden age. Slang words and Indian vocabulary appeared. The Arabic phrases of the text indicate the weak Arabic literacy of the authors. The poems in the Shakibani's Maqamat suffers from a lack of power and beauty. They even fail to maintain proper meter. In the Maqamats, social and economic issues are addressed in the stories. They include a dance party of teenage dancers at a wedding party in Obe, a village east of Herat. The popular currency of Iran in Herat, the presence of Zoroastrians in Herat in the 19th century, the presence of women Sufis, the presence and trading of slaves, addition to marijuana among the Sufis and other things. One of the valuable benefits of Maqamat is the description of the condition of tribes and small ethnic groups, their suffering and problems that the official history of Afghanistan has avoided mentioning. These people, who mainly lived in the Herat and Badghis regions in their ancestral lands, were forcibly displaced by the governments of Afghanistan, especially during the period of Abdurrahman Khan. The book of Maqamat provides some insight into the lives of these people and their experiences under government rule, which are essential for writing the social history of these regions. Conclusion. In the history of Afghanistan, especially in the 19th century, a few local sources, including anthologies and Maqamats, have been neglected but are beginning to receive the attention they deserve. In addition to their special literary value, this type of prose sometimes deal with the historical, social, and cultural developments of regions far from important cities. Barnabadi's anthology offers a fresh perspective on the political and social landscape of Herat and beyond, spanning the 16th to 19th centuries. This view diverges significantly from the narrative presented in official Afghan historical sources. Various Sufi Islam's Maqamats written by different authors in the 19th century in Herat, Badghis, and Faryab in northwest Afghanistan are another category of these valuable sources. From these sources, it becomes clear how the ruling apparatus of the time used Sufis and heated the fire of religious conflicts for the continuation of power. These sources include the Afghan narrative of the famous Shakiban battle in 1807 and the subsequent political developments in Herat. Thank you and happy holidays.
Thank you both so much. I learned a great deal from both of the presentations, as I'm sure all of our participants did as well. We do have a couple of questions, but if you would give me, if you would allow me just to kind of maybe put the two of you in conversation as well. Because in a way, it seems to me that, it seems to me that Dr. Arian is sort of is continuing sort of where Dr. Afzali leaves off the narrative, the evolution of a particular genre of writing, which I thought was really interesting in the 19th century, moving from what you were calling historical biographies, to historical works that do much more than that, that document social conditions in society, that talk about social challenges in society. And so they go well beyond what one might, so in a way they become sort of encyclopedic works for a particular moment or era. But I also was really fascinated by your reference to the Maromot, because having studied, as you say, and you listed the historical sources in Persian of the Afghan-Iran conflicts, it is really interesting it is actually, from a historical perspective, fascinating to see that, how that narrative then is told through the Maromot literature, which I was not familiar with, but because of your presentation, I'm going to now go and try to explore it more. And for Dr. Arian, I also was really fascinated with the way in which you sort of show a transitional moment into modern literature in Afghanistan. And one of the things actually that you didn't talk about, but you talk about Mahmoud Darzi, is of course sort of a literary, like the evolution also of a literary language, sort of almost like an official type of writing, which I wondered if you could maybe perhaps talk a little bit about nationalism and nation building as well. I don't want to start with my own sort of questions, but I did want to sort of find a way to perhaps bridge the two talks that covered that sort of blend into each other, from in a chronological period. We do have a few questions here, and so I think we'll begin with in the order that they were presented. Is that okay with you guys? Is that okay, Professors Arian and Afzali, if we go through the chat and proceed in that way?
Yeah,
Great.
yes, great.
So I think the first question we have is from Saeed Tabibi, who says to Mr. Arian, I have a question regarding characterization and identity. I'm having difficulty with this. One second.
I have the question here.
Yeah, if you could just, read
Yes.
it or answer it, that would be great.
How the characters are developed and portrayed in modern discourse of narrative. It is a good question. I spoke about two different kinds of narrative and two different kinds of discourse in the 100 years of Persian novel or Persian storytelling in Afghanistan. So when we speak about classic discourse and classic narrative, so in classic narrative and discourse, we have types or types. In Farsi, they say type. No character. There's no character. There's only types or types. Just types of the people are working as character in the stories. But when we come to the modern history, to the modern narrative, in the modern discourse, there's individuality, individual. So the characters are individual, and they have their own characteristics and their own, body. And also the next thing that I'm going to mention here, that past-centered or past-oriented narratives and discourse were, objective. The discourse and also the narrative was completely objective. So when we come to the modern time, and when this transition came, and we came from past to the present and from classic to the modern, so the objectivity changed to subjectivity. I told you that in classic discourse and narrative, there is a value outside of the world of the subject. There is no subject. Subject is completely eliminated from the process. So what is important in classic discourse and classic narrative, that is the value that is outside of the body of the subject. But when we come to the modern, all the values are inside the subject. So subject is not looking for something outside his body. So all the things are in the body of the subject, and the subject is looking for the values inside himself, not outside of the body or outside of the discourse. And the next question that I have here from Muhammad Arif Ahmadi, he says, what are the main differences between the first generation of storytelling and the current generation from political aspects? In other words, which generation of storytelling has a positive impact on the political aspects of society? Listen, when I used generation, it was the narrative generation, not the narrator's generation. I was not speaking about the people. I was speaking about the course of the narrative. So it means that this generation not refer to the persons, to the people. It refers to the intrinsic characteristics of the narrative and discourse. So what I want to add here and say here that after the year 2000, when Rahnavard Zaryab started to write and to publish his novels, this transformation and this transition occurred. So after Rahnavard Zaryab, we completely, moved from classical narrative and classical discourse to modern and to digital discourse and narrative, with the writing of the novel Gulnar and the Mirror, or Gulnar Aina. After this novel, the paradigm shift has occurred. So this paradigm shift is started by Rahnavard Zaryab with the novel of the Gulnar and the Mirror, or Gulnar Aina. And the question from Professor Kashani: how do new political themes evolve, or how are familiar themes such as heroization recast in modern Afghan literature? Dear Dr. Firoozeh, can you reword your question?
So I'm just wondering how, because a lot of the way the literature evolves is, as you yourself say, that there is a sense of heroization. And so that does tend to be a trope, right? That is a literary trope. I'd like to understand what helps the transition to move away from this and to consider new genres. I mean, what kind of both external events or evolutions, like transitions, enable this, but also within the field of Afghan literature itself, what kind of internal conversations are enabling this shift to occur?
That's a great question. As I mentioned, Rahnavard Zaryab, that in Afghanistan people pretend that Rahnavard Zaryab is Afghan Marquez, and he has the same stage as Sadiq Hidayat in Iran, and he was the one who was familiar with the Western literature, and especially with the French literature. And his wife is Pujmai Zaryab, who is one of the best, storyteller and writers of Afghanistan, novelist. She also has studied the French literature at Kabul University, and they were, they were in France for many years. So after 2000, when there was a big political change in Afghanistan and Taliban went and a new government came and a new horizon, opened in Afghanistan. So most of the writers, novelists, poets that they were outside of Afghanistan, they came back to Afghanistan, like Rahnavard Zaryab and like many other writers in poetry or poem, people like Said Rezai Mohammadi and so many other figures. When they came to Afghanistan, they were familiar with the changes in the generation of narratives and discourses in Western literature. So they applied these changes in Afghanistan. And after that, after Rahnavard Zaryab, most of the other writers like Khosravi Moni, that Khosravi Moni is one of the significant figure in novel writing in Afghanistan. So after Rahnavard Zaryab, these other figures started to be familiar with the narrative techniques, with the new generations of discourse and the new generations of narrative. So I think this was the most important point for this shift or for this paradigm shift in storytelling of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those very informed and detailed replies. I also have a question here for Dr. Afzali, which I put in the chat, but
Yeah,
I will, yeah. Do you want to read it? And then
yeah, I read it. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah, it's a very good question. The problem is that for this region, for example, for the northwestern of Afghanistan, we do not have any other history sources. Because of this, we should use the biographies, the anthologies, and the Magamat books that the Sufi circles have written. Because in these books, we can find some social and some cultural features and issues about the people of Herat, about the some ethnic groups that the official historians of the Kabul court they didn't want to talk about them because of, for example, for the Battle of Shakiban, because it was the result of this battle was defeat for the Afghan army. The Kabul court's historians didn't want to say about it and just say they passed very quickly from this battle. But in the stories of Magamat and in the lives of the some biographies of the poets, we can find some features, and also in the Magamat of Ibrahim Shakibani, as I explained, he mentioned all the martyrs of Afghan side. He said about that the day of the battle, he with the old details that previously we didn't have this information. But the other parties that they were involved on that battle, for example, the Iranian side, for example, the Russian side, the English and the British side, all of them say their accounts, but we do not have the Afghan side, and because of there is no any other sources to complete to receive a picture from this period, we should use. I know it's incomplete, and there is no any other option for us. Yes.
Thank you. And, I couldn't agree with you more. I think particularly when you look at the 19th century, even for Iran. So, for example, after the Russo-Persian War of, that ended the second one in 1828, 1826 to 1828, the Iranians, the account that is often used is Tarikh-e-No, and even in that work, because it's also a defeat. So I thought this was really interesting, perhaps an interesting comparison that could have been drawn or that can be drawn. And in that too, so the writer was trying to sort of kind of find an explanation for, or partial explanation for the defeat, other than to say the army was, just didn't perform well, or Iran lost, very simply. They said, there was an eclipse or something like that. They were trying to find sort of alternative kind of reasons why this happened. happened. But I think the larger point is, and I completely agree with you, is that, especially in the 19th century, we have to use whatever literary sources we have, because you never know what you find in the middle of them, and also what I really appreciated was, and I was going to ask you this question, but you addressed it in your presentation, was you refer to the 3 different manuscript sources that you use. I think that's really very significant, to do a close comparison and to see what's been added or changed or written differently. I think actually in Qajar writings of the 19th century, Qajar historiography, we don't do that enough. For example, the Lisan al-Mulk, yeah, so we don't, I think we need a very close reading and comparison. We typically use the same published editions, and it would be very, very interesting if some of us had the time, or others, if people sort of invested and to do the kind of work that you're doing, which is to do a very close reading and comparison of extant manuscript sources. Or even, for example, there are other sort of Qajar historians in the Etimad Saltane, kind of comparing his accounts. Again, as a historian, and it bothers me, actually, I have to be honest with you, that I go with these published editions, and I don't always have easy access to these manuscript sources, but I go, with whatever has been considered, like the sort of the authoritative edited version that we use. But I think it's invaluable, the work that you want to do with the Maqamat in particular, to try to do this close reading and analysis, to try to glean information not only about a particular moment or battle or whatever, but also through them to be able to read a little bit more about what was happening in society as a whole. So thank you very, very much, both of you. I'm sure the audience would agree that it was such a erudite conversation we had, and so much to learn. And I wish the Western Academy actually would create more spaces and attention to these really kind of important historical questions that Afghan scholars such as you, really can shed light on, and the transition of the historiography, also historical facts that you've all really shed a lot of light on today, as well as literature as well. So I'm checking the chat to see if there are any other questions. I don't believe that there are. So thank you again very much. Thank you to Professor Nasr Arian and Professor Khalil Afzali, and to Mimi Kirk of the Mesa Global Academy, and to my department, the History Department at Penn. Thank you everyone for coming. We hope you enjoyed it as much as I know I did, and I hope you all did as well. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Firoozeh. Dr. Afzali, thank you so much for this nice presentation, and also Mimi, thank you for providing this opportunity, and thank you from all the participants. So it was a great opportunity, and I learned many things from the presentation of Dr. Afzali, and from the comments that you have, Professor Firoozeh. So thank you so much from all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.